helping people play well together. I heard that's one of your quotes. So what does that mean?
Yes. I often say that I help people play well together, and people will ask me, well, what does that mean, Nan? And my response typically is that, no, I'm not trying to teach people how to play soccer. I'm trying to teach them how to work together more effectively so people can actually have some fun while they are doing that work.
Excellent. And how do they do that?
Oh, well, there's many ways to do that. Well, first is it's really important to build engagement and build connections. Because when we start to build connections with our team members, ideally we start to actually build some friendships. And I am not saying we have to be friends with everyone we work with. I'm not saying roll out the couch and become everyone's best friend. But when you think about it, who do you support? And if somebody's having a hard time at work, if someone isn't getting their work done, if you understand the context as to why that is happening, you're going to show up differently for them. And we don't understand the context of people's lives unless we know something about their lives.
We tend to refer to that as being a protective factor. You're someone can reach out to help you
Correct.
build your resilience. Yep.
Yeah. But that's, I think you have the question in there later that I often talk about being a human doing versus a human being. And if we only treat people like human doings, we treat them like they're rags to be wrung out. We just want more and more and more out of them. But when we feel like people see us as a person, they see us as a human being who has feelings and goals and objectives, that then we can support them. Because knowing what people's goals are, even when they're not related to work, if we can engage them, we are going to be much more effective. Because research has proven that when we engage somebody, even on their personal goals, it actually shifts how they show up at work because they feel noticed, seen, appreciated.
A component of that whole playing well together is conflict. It's going to come up. So you talk about conflict competent. What does that mean?
Well, it's funny because my expertise, I would like to think my expertise is around teamwork. And a lot of times when people think about teamwork, there's a reason there's work in that phrase. Because it takes some work. It takes skills, it takes behaviors, it takes showing up. And in order to be an effective team member, I'll often say teamwork is an individual skill. It starts with us and how we show up. And if we don't understand how to manage conflict as an individual, we're setting our team up oftentimes to fail. And so when I think about conflict competence is understanding that it's a normal byproduct of human interaction. It's just going to happen. Even the people you love, you have conflict with them sometimes. And so are you willing to have a difficult conversation? Are you willing to lean into the conflict? Because the conflict usually isn't the problem. Oftentimes something good will come out of the conflict. The difficulty is we don't know how to manage that conflict. You know, nobody gets up in the morning and are like, yeah, I can't wait to go to work because I have a conflict. Most people are like, oh, don't make me, okay? And it's because they don't know how to deal with it effectively. And so teaching people some skills, and it was, as I often talk about, you know, it's about reframing. If we think of conflict as something negative, we don't want to do it. But if we recognize that we can get innovation, improve relationships, we then will get something out of the conflict. But it's knowing how to manage it. And so it's teaching people some skills about how to engage people through a difficult conversation. How do we disagree in a respectful manner? How do we make sure people feel like they're heard and respected during those conversations? People forget that you can disagree with someone and still like them. It doesn't mean that you have to, just because you acknowledge and accept them, that doesn't mean you have to do what they're saying, that you have to accept it, but you need to acknowledge it.
So what are some ways that, you kind of mentioned a little bit, but what are some ways that we can become conflict competent?
Okay.
Like hands-on stuff.
Oh, well, this is like a 5-hour course just in that. Well, one of the first things is I always say is you have to know what your hot buttons are, because you have to know what are the triggers that are going to push you over the edge, because only when you know what your triggers are can you decide how you're going to show up differently. And I don't know whether you want this, but I often use an example. Like my youngest daughter, actually it was my oldest daughter, came home one time and she's like, Mom, you're worse than a wicked stepmother. And I'm thinking, wow, this is what Disney's done for me as a parent. And the hair goes up on the back of my neck, and part of me's like, you want to see what, and I was just like, ooh, but I had to step back and be like, I'm the adult here. Okay, so what happened? And when she said, you're worse than a wicked stepmother, what I heard her say, I was a bad mom. And I think we've all been in a conflict situation where someone says something, but we hear something very different. We start to tell ourselves a story. And so we have to think about what is our story, and we have to unpack it. For me, it's competent. I don't need to be the best, but I want to be in the top 50 percentile. And when I heard her saying I was a bad mom, that got to me. As a working parent, I don't have enough time for myself, my partner, my house, my kids. I felt like I was neglecting someone. And so it's first acknowledging that we tell ourselves these stories, and that I had a choice about how I showed up when she made those comments. And so with conflict, we often react, and we have a choice to respond. And that choice is always ours, and it's often based on that story we tell ourselves. And so that's where you almost always have to start. It's kind of a piece of mindfulness. Like, how do you want to show up? How do you want to be remembered? And that's where you have to start. But then it's learning how to manage a difficult conversation. And for me, oftentimes with a difficult conversation, most people don't spend enough time preparing for that difficult conversation. They just dive right into the conversation. And I often say that we have to pass with care through a difficult conversation. And the pass is your prep work before you meet with the other person. So it often starts with, are you really clear about your purpose? What is the conflict? What's the impact to other people? How do you see it? What do you want out of the conversation? And you have to think about, what do you want to be different, both from what I say, a task and a relationship perspective. Okay, so we have to be really crystal clear on our purpose. But then the A really is about our attitude. It is that mindset that I just talked about. And we have to think about, what's keeping me from having this conversation. So it's not just my attitude about thinking about a response versus reacting, but it's also what's keeping me from sharing my voice. Okay, and many times it is, we've had some bad experiences in our life where people reacted negatively, and we don't want to lean into the conversation, because really we've only had to have one or two bad conflicts where people are like, yeah, I'm not going there. But if we show up differently, they will. And so we have to think about what our attitude is to it. Again, if we know what our hot buttons are, how do we center ourselves going into the conversation? It's going to be very different. The first S, is really what I call your strategy. Okay? Have you really sat down and thought about, how am I going to manage this conversation? How are we going to structure the conversation? If we're going to problem solve together, does the other person know any problem solving tools that they use? But I often say the part of the strategy is the meeting before the meeting. If you go tap somebody on the shoulder and just say to them, hey, can we talk? How does that make you feel? Most people are like, oh, you get sweaty, you get uncomfortable. It's like, now what? So rather than doing that, I suggest you have the meeting before the meeting. And the meeting before the meeting is where you say, hey, when we were working together last week, this thing happened. Can we find a time to talk about that? And so you're trying to find a time that works for them, because what you're trying to do is show agreement before a potential disagreement. And so you have a conversation and let them be part of the conversation about where, when, how you're going to meet, how long the meeting is going to be, because you want a neutral space and you want to go at a pace that feels reasonable for them. Okay? And so you have a strategy around the meeting. You do that work and you've already set a very different tone. And the last one of the pass is the S, is it's like, script your start. And scripting your start is being very, very clear about, again, what you want different, both from a task and a relationship. You go back to some of your comments you made earlier about your purpose. And I almost say when you script it, you almost always build a question into it. Because building the question and is inviting them into the conversation and signaling that I really want to know your perspective before I share my perspective. Okay? And so that pass with care, you haven't even had your meeting, but you have to do all this prep work in advance to center yourself. But that's also why you have the meeting before the meeting, is you have to give them a chance to center their selves and really think about their story. And if you found that neutral space and neutral place, space and place and time, it's going to be a very different conversation.
100%. Leveraging team member talents. How do we figure out what other people's talents are?
Well, one of the easiest things to do is just ask them. Ask them what they think their superpowers are. Oftentimes I'll ask individuals, I'll just say, hey, what are you known for? What do your friends and family members come to you for? Why do they come to you versus somebody else? And so for me, it's a good place to start because it gives them a chance to share in their own voice. But this is also the value of using different assessments, whether you're using the DISC or Insights or Myers-Briggs or whatever it is you want to use. There's all kinds of good free tools like 16 Personalities. But when you have a common language around personality types and personality styles, it also contributes to knowing how people show up. And it sometimes will give you some insight as to what their strengths are, like Strengths Finders. Like, no doubt anybody who knows me has done Strengths Finders. Woo is mine. It's like I love meeting new people. I love interacting with them. And when we take that time and we piece our teams together in a way that we're really leveraging strengths, it doesn't feel so much like work. So when I was a bank regulator, I clearly was in the wrong job, but I often wanted to do things nobody else wanted to do. And it actually made me a superstar because I would stand out because I did things differently, but I was doing things that were fun for me. I often say with teamwork, fair does not mean equal. I do not care what your job is, what environment you're in. You have to learn to leverage your team members differently. Yes, we all have some responsibility to completing our job, but who are you going to go to when somebody needs to speak for the team or the whole group? Who are you going to go to when there needs to be somebody who really digs a little deeper into the analysis or can take a complex issue and simplify it? There are people who have these gifts that don't show up necessarily in job descriptions. And sometimes if you just ask people, they'll tell you.
Okay. Another part of people playing well together is making decisions that stick. Now, in the field, that's hard because sometimes we're working with other adults who are parents. Mm-hmm. We're working with children. We're working with regulators. Sometimes we have directors. So we have all these different people and we're trying to get all of their needs met. And so that can sometimes lead to conflict, which, we have to make tough decisions. What advice do you have for people to help them make those tough decisions?
Well, there are two questions you ask me. How do you make decisions that stick, and how do you make tough decisions? And on some level, they are the same. We're never going to please everyone. And so one of the things that is important is to identify who the stakeholders are. Who are the people who are going to be impacted by the decision? And you can't always have everyone be part of the decision, but you at least need to factor in who they are and what their needs, interests, and wants are, okay? Because you really don't want to include everyone because it becomes far too complex at some level. But what we often forget is that we're going to be more effective if we use a structured problem-solving and decision-making process. And we don't teach people how to use some really simple tools on how to make decisions. I use tools like really basic, like multi-voting, like brainstorm as many options as are out there and everyone gets so many votes. And, and when we do that, people feel like they've been heard. They've been engaged in the process. And I said before, it's more important to be heard than agreed with. And we need to engage people because if they feel like they're part of the conversation, even if they disagree with the decision, if they understand how you made the decision, they are part of the conversation. They might be like, yeah, I don't like that decision, but I know it was the best decision given the options we had at the time. But when people either aren't part of the decision-making process, or if we don't explain the decision when they aren't part of the process, they're always going to second guess you. And so it's finding a way to be transparent if people can't be part of the process, to communicate with them how we made the decision, what the factors were we considered, and so they understand whether we took their perspective into consideration or not. And that can make all the difference sometimes.
100%. So we've made that decision. How do we make it stick?
Well, when people are part of the decision, they're more likely to buy into it. I mean, that's just the truth of it. I know this seems like an odd example, but when my kids were growing up, it's like I had the right just to issue consequences when they broke the rules. But it would be like, we're going to talk about this tomorrow when you're not upset and when I'm not upset. And I would explain why I was upset. I'd be like, here are the consequences. Now you come up with 2 consequences. Now you get to pick which of those consequences you want. And when they got to pick their consequence, they always followed through. And sometimes I'm like, why are you picking that one? I would never pick that one. It would have been their consequence. But when people are part of the decision-making process, they buy into it differently. When we understand a decision, we buy into it differently. But when somebody makes decisions for us, our natural reaction is to push against it. It's like, who are you to make this decision for me? And we get pissed. And so when we can engage people in the process, again, even if they don't get the answer they want, they're like, I get it.
I gotta ask, like, what's an example of a consequence they'd pick? Because I'm thinking of what I'd pick, and it would be like, go pet the dog.
No, I'm telling you, we used to do that with Serinda. She's my daughter. She's 17. Her consequences were always far worse than the ones that we were putting on the
Wow.
plate.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it gets to, though, they own it because they chose it. Because if they don't buy into your rules, they won't do it. And that's with anybody. If you have rules and consequences that they don't buy into, that they think are invalid, and this goes to oftentimes on our teams, many times with our teams, that supposedly there's a consequence for bad behavior, and when we don't follow through also on those bad behaviors, it just sucks the life out of your entire team. The lowest common denominator always wins, and as soon as people see team members being allowed to behave poorly, it's like, why am I trying so hard? And so we have to be clear many times when we're making decisions or we're going through any change, what's the benefit for you changing and what's the cost for not? And then we need to hold them accountable. And that goes back to those difficult conversations. You give them a chance to correct a behavior, but at some point you do have to hold them accountable. But we can't hold people accountable if they don't understand where their behavior has gone astray. If you haven't coached them and provided them some guidance and support to resolve that issue. And only when you've done that, then is it fair to really think about doling out those consequences.
I know we're talking about adult interactions, but I could see this working so well with providers on how to work with their children on conflict resolution and rule setting and follow through.
Funny thing is, what works with 5-year-olds works with 50-year-olds. Humans are humans. And most of the time, and this is why, unfortunately, that respect activity didn't work today, but it all comes down to respect in my mind. When people don't feel respected, that's when they become angry, irritable, disengaged, frustrated. And I learned that pretty young, that even, with my children, if they said at the age of 8, I don't want to do that, it'd be like, well, let's talk about it. And if I understood their reasons for not wanting to do it, it'd be like, okay, well, you know you better than I know you. And so we have to trust, as I said, that people don't show up just to piss us off. People don't show up to do a bad job. But we have to understand where people are coming from, what their perspective is, what their story is. That sometimes with daycare providers, they had every intentions to do the right thing. They thought they were doing the right thing because in the moment, in that context, there was something that caused them to think differently. And part of our job is to understand what was different, because only then can we coach them on maybe what their other options might have been. And sometimes we're going to learn from them to recognize that, that maybe was a good option in that scenario, because unfortunately, rules and regulations don't address every scenario. And that's the hard part about being a regulator, is that you have to learn to be a critical thinker. And one of the things I've learned is that I have blind spots, and I'm a better thinker when I think with someone else, because they stretch my thinking, and they often cause me to see things from a different perspective. And, two brains are better than one usually. So I want to know what's going on.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, and we hear about this all the time. We have to be transparent. So what does transparent mean, and how do we do it?
Well, it goes back to my conversation about passing with care. We have to know what our purpose is. We have to know what our larger goal and objective is. And we also have to think about what we do want out of the conversation. And so if we understand what our purpose is, we're going to be much more open. Like, we don't want to make people guess. It's what has been referred to as kind of above the line and below the line. There's what we think, and it's how it impacts us and how we feel. And we often focus on the data and the facts, but we also have to make it safe for people to talk about what that means to them. Because oftentimes, especially even in a conflict situation, I'm irritated that you didn't get that. There is a consequence for a report coming in late, but the bigger issue is that I'm irritated because I don't feel respected, because you knew I had to do something with that. And oftentimes we forget that it's the feeling and the meaning that goes with the conversation that throws off the entire dynamic. And so part of the transparency is, can we speak to our own need? Can we talk about what we're seeing and what it means to us? And many times we aren't transparent about that. It's easier to point the finger at someone and be like, you never take me out to dinner. Whereas if we said, I'm really tired of cooking. Can we talk about how to do this differently? How we might share? That's a completely different conversation. And so the transparency means you have to be clear and be able to speak to your needs. And sometimes we don't want to do that because we can get rejected. And even at work, as a regulator, I could tell them what they needed or I thought they needed to do, and they could be like, no, it's just not a priority. Given our limited resources, that is not a priority. And then it becomes a discussion about, okay, if we can only fix 3 to 5 things because of limited resources, what are the most important things? And so it's always pushing for more understanding, because only with that transparency can you go back to really what are my priorities compared to your priorities, and how do we end up at the same place?
And you also talk about needing to know what our needs are, and you kind of just alluded to this, what our needs are, and being able to articulate them in a way that the other person can hear. Why is that important, and how do we do that?
Well, like I said, if I was to come at you and be like, hey, you just never take me out to eat, it's going to make the other person defensive. When you use those you phrases, you never, you always, you've already set yourself up for a conflict. And so learning to make what I call really small communication adjustments makes it easier for us to have a very engaging conversation. And so our transparency, again, we have to go back to our purpose. We have to be able to speak to our need. And this is really hard for some people to do. Like, I'll be honest, I'm coaching a woman right now who is warm. I talked about people being warm and assertive. She's very warm. She works with senior citizens. I mean, she's a lovely woman, and she's not very assertive. She doesn't know how to speak to her needs. She has spent so much time being a people pleaser, she doesn't know how to speak to her need. And when we speak to need isn't just what I need to be done differently. I need you to complete this report. I need you to do this budget. I need you to handle the children this way. But need also is, how do I want to be treated as a person? And I think we forget that. And sometimes when I'm working with people, they're like, why do they call that soft skills? Learning to treat and work around and address people's needs, it's really hard because it requires us to listen at a really deep level and to ask a lot of questions. Most of us aren't very skilled at that.
You stressed that, and I heard you say this earlier in your presentation, that if you want more out of life, pay attention to what others want. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, it's kind of basic human need. If I'm not meeting your needs, you're never going to meet mine. That's what engagement and partnership is all about. That's what respect is. I have to know what's important to you to address your needs. And it goes back to that being a good listener. Because if you don't think I'm listening to you, you're never going to listen to me. Okay? And if we're not even listening to each other, how can we even begin to address each other's needs? And it's a simple thing, like I think about, my daughter and I, we cook together. And one time we both needed a lemon and I had one lemon. Okay. Well, I'm like, well, what do you need it for? She's like, well, I need the juice, Mom. Whatever. And I'm like, oh, I just need the zest. I'm like, we can make this work out. It's what they call a growth mindset. Instead of thinking it's you or me, it's my way or the highway, or you get what, it's a competition. Rarely is life a competition. If we really understand what the other person wants, oftentimes we want different things. And so how do you support them in getting what they want? And guess what? You do that for them, they're going to show up differently for you.
So the 5 P's of problem solving, we've got plan, people, process, purpose, and perspective. Can you talk about planning for problem solving? Well, wait a minute. Did we do this?
Kind of.
Yeah? Okay.
Kind of. And that's why I say it. I've shifted how I do things. And so when we have to problem solve, we always need to plan. And that planning, again, is that meeting before the meeting. And so we have to think about where are we going to meet, when are we going to meet. So I was working, actually, it was funny because I was working with some bankers, and they wanted their customers to come in and restructure some loans. And they're like, we just can't get them to come in. And I'm like, well, there's your first problem. You need to go to them. And so part of every problem-solving process is that discussion about where are we going to meet, when are we going to meet, how long is it going to be, when are we going to take a break, and understanding that when we're dealing with a difficult problem, it's going to be multiple meetings. And so you have to plan to have a problem-solving type process.
And that brings us to people.
Yeah. Do you have the right people in the seats? Do you have the people who are impacted and the people who have the power and authority to make the decisions sometimes when you're working through a problem? And oftentimes, as one director once told me, Nan, shit rolls downhill. That oftentimes that we will think that the people we're problem solving for and with are the ones who come to us with the problem. And as they've pointed out to me, sometimes it's because they don't want to deal with the problem. And we often have to figure out really who's the sponsor, who's the person who really wants the solution, who's going to make it happen, who's going to run interference, who, when we have a solution, are going to be the first ones in line to be like, hey, my team first. Because if you don't know who your sponsor is and who the stakeholders are in the process, you may be coming up with a solution for the wrong people. So when we're going through a problem-solving process, again, oftentimes people aren't very good at doing problem solving and decision making because they don't have many process tools. And what I've discovered is the more tools you have, the more effective you'll be, because you know how to bring other people into the conversation, and you know how to take that information and sort through it in a way that everyone feels valued, engaged in the conversation. Unfortunately, we often don't want to engage people because we're like, yeah, what am I going to do with all this information? And if you have a clear process that other people understand and you work them through the process, they're going to be much more engaged, and you're going to end up probably with an outcome that people are all more satisfied with. And so it's teaching people process tools in order to be more effective.
And then we've got purpose.
Well, why have the conversation? Purpose is the reason for the problem many times, is we have to go back to what it is you're trying to accomplish. What's the desired outcome look like? What does success look like? And that's one of the issues I run into when I'm working with groups around problem solving. They all know what's wrong, but they don't know what success looks like. And that is one of the hardest things to define. I can complain all day long about what I don't like, but you need to tell me what success looks like. Because only when we know what success looks like can we identify the gap. Okay, what's keeping us from our current to our desired state? So we have to be really clear what our purpose is. What do we want to be different? What does success look like? Because until we define that, you're never going to get there.
And then perspective.
Yes. Well, I mentioned this before, that when you're trying to problem solve, it's about knowing that there are multiple perspectives. Rarely is there one right answer, and rarely does one person have the whole vision. I don't know about you, but we all have different educations, different values, different backgrounds, different experiences that causes us to see things through a very different lens. And so I always think better when I'm thinking with someone else, but it's also figuring out, how do I hear their perspective? Am I creating that space so that their voice is heard? And how do I draw that perspective into the process? And again, that's why you have to have the right people and the right process to figure out, how do we bring in multiple perspectives? Because if we try and come up with a solution that people don't buy into, it's not going to be effective. I used to work for an international consulting firm, and one of the things they used to tell us is that 100% logical answer that nobody buys into isn't effective. But if we have a solution that's 80% that people buy into because they feel like their perspectives have been heard, you start to create momentum. You can always go back and shift the solution and shift the direction, but you can't if people don't feel like they are part of the process, that their perspective hasn't been considered. And so for me, it's really important that all 5 Ps get incorporated in. You got to have the right plan, you got to have the right people, you have to have the right process, you have to engage people's perspectives, and I don't remember what the other 5th one is at the moment.
As you were talking and you were saying it's important to get other people's perspectives, sometimes, as you said, people come from different places. So people may have had their own, say in childcare, they think back to their own schooling and the experiences they've had, and they bring that kind of trauma with them, so that when you're trying to get someone's perspective, they're not very willing to give it, or maybe they're just introverted or shy, or there's a language barrier. What are some ways that we can get those perspectives?
That's a really loaded question. Trying to get people's perspectives is an art form, and it takes a lot of time. So oftentimes getting people's perspectives is difficult because they maybe have never been asked for their perspective, or when they have been asked, it's been used against them. And so in order to get people to share their perspectives, they have to feel safe. And I'll be honest, we all come with steamer trucks of baggage. Every organization we've worked for, every place we've been, we pick up some bags. Sometimes they serve us well, sometimes they don't. And as an individual, we have to recognize that this is a different person I'm interacting. This is a different team that I'm interacting with. And our job as individuals is to throw those bags up on the shelf, or they're to throw them off the train. We don't necessarily need all of that. Every relationship is different. And so we have a choice when we're working with someone in thinking about how we show up for them. Now, if we show up consistently in a positive and supportive and inquisitive manner where we're trying to engage them, at some point we start to build what we refer to as psychological safety. They may not feel safe the first time we have a conversation to ask them for input. They may not want to engage with us, maybe even the second or the third time, but our reputation precedes us. If they start to recognize that you do really respect them, that they are safe, even talking about problems, they then will start to open up in a very different way. But we have to know that, whether we're talking to, the daycare providers or our own, because we are all projecting on some level our stuff. And we have to know what the difference is. Like, I'm not going to teach you about mindfulness, but it is a really, we all probably need to go to therapy, just like we need to rotate our tires occasionally. Sometimes we need somebody to help kick some things around and make sure that we're in balance. Because if we can't show up as our best self, we can't expect them to give us their best.
So you talked earlier to me about reframing and about how the you. So are there certain phrases that you can suggest that we can use to help get people to share their perspectives?
Oh, absolutely. I almost always say, always start with a question. So if we want people to engage us differently and we want to go from, we want to reframe the conversation, there are some really simple communication tweaks that we can make. So first, we need to always think about, are we speaking for ourselves? Not that you want to start every sentence with an I, but when we start sentences like you never, you're setting yourself up for a defensive conversation. Okay? We're often going to be much more effective if we learn then to ask questions. Okay? And one of the things I try and teach people is, I don't know if everyone ever learned, they're the journalist's 6 questions, the who, what, where, when, why, how, and why. Might have gotten those wrong, but who, what, where, when, why, and how. And 3 of those questions are closed-ended. You don't want to use them because it's going to be a really short conversation. When you say who, when, or where, it's a very short conversation. You want to create a dialogue, not a monologue. And so that leaves you the why, what, and how. Now, 2 of those are my favorite questions. The 3rd one is a really good problem-solving question, not a good place to start. And that's that why question. When we asked, why did you do that? Why wasn't that done? We make people defensive. And so one of the most powerful things I try and get people to do is just ask more questions. The best negotiators in the world will tell you, it's not about having the answers. It's about asking the questions. And so if you can ask them, what was going on at the time? How was this different than last time? How do you think we could move this forward? And so trying to use those what and how questions are going to shift your entire dynamic. Also, if, again, you speak to your need versus judging them using those you statements. And another really simple tweak, drives me crazy, is it's that Minnesota Nice sandwich. Okay, that's what we call it. On the internet, they refer to it as the shit sandwich. Compliment, criticism, compliment. It's passive aggressive. And as soon as somebody hears that but or however, they're like, oh yeah, here it comes. Get rid of but and however from your language, okay? And however is nothing but a pretty but, okay? You just think you're getting all fancy. If you can take but and however out of your language and replace it with an and, speak to your need, ask what and how questions, those 3 simple changes are going to have a profound impact on your dynamics.
We were talking about conflict, and I've seen on your website and heard you say conflict is costly. What does that mean?
Most people don't leave organizations. They leave bosses and they leave conflict. Okay? That conflict is costly because I don't know about you, but when you've ever had a conflict, whether it's at home or with a coworker, have you ever ruminated over it? Like, oh my gosh, can you believe they did that? And I don't know how we're going to solve this. And this is so annoying. And, we do a lot of raging, a lot of frustration. We waste a lot of time. Imagine that if you wasted 15 minutes a day complaining about an issue or a problem over a conflict. If you spend 15 minutes a day, you take that times 5, and you start to add that up every month, that adds up to a lot of lost productivity. Plus, it doesn't even speak to the cost of disengagement and morale because people are really tired of listening to people complain or avoiding the conflict, that we lose a lot of productivity, we lose a lot of engagement because we're not willing to put the conflict on the table. Instead, we talk about it behind each other's backs. We gossip about it, and that serves no purpose. It's extremely counterproductive on every front. And so it's learning how to, again, know what our need is, be willing to have a difficult conversation. And again, you have a difficult conversation. You might not get what you want, but it might be better than it was. And all you can hope is progress. But we're never going to get that progress unless we're not having the conversation.
So you look at challenging conversations through the lens of purpose, attitude, strategy, and script.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That was the pass.
Okay, so we did that.
We
Yes,
talked
we
about
did
so
that.
pass with
Yay!
care.
I didn't see. I didn't.
But
register
sometimes
with
if
me.
I don't have much time, then I talk about it as space, pace, and grace.
Right.
So what was that question?
I was just going to ask you to walk us through the purpose, attitude, strategy, and script, but could you walk us through space, pace, and grace?
So my pass with care model is that planning process, and it's doing all the prep work. The easiest way for me to remember when I have a difficult conversation with someone, whether it's a conflict in negotiations, anything like that, problem solving, I try and remember the model, space, pace, and grace. And space is, how do I get in the right mindset? Our conversation today was, I used the word reframe. So is it space? Is it reframe? But how do we reframe and think about this as, is this a power struggle? Or do they have, really important perspectives to share? Do I need to understand their perspective? So how do I get in the right mindset? Okay, that's what that space is all about. The pace is, how do I slow the conversation down so the other person feels heard? Okay, the pace is, if we ask questions, we're going to have a more meaningful conversation. I know sometimes when I'm working with teams, people will hire me and it's like, Nan, can you help us make decisions more, efficiently? And I'm like, well, do you want efficient or do you want effective? Okay, effective means making everybody's voice heard. And that's that slowing down the conversation. That's that space. Okay? And the last one then is grace. Are you showing up in a way that they feel valued and respected? So are you asking them questions? Okay? Do you allow them to vent for a hot minute if they need to? But that doesn't mean you have to allow that. You may have to set some boundaries. But grace is showing up respectfully. If I understood you correctly, this is what you said. Did I get that right? And what I love about that, using that paraphrasing, is sometimes they might be like, no, you totally missed it. And it's like, oh, well, what did I miss? Okay. And right away you've shifted the dynamics. But the other advantage of asking a question and then trying to paraphrase, it gives you a hot minute if you are ticked off. Like, how do I say this in a way that sounds respectful? Where if you say, if I heard you correctly, or you ask them a question, that gives you a hot minute to catch your breath. And then think about, how do I want to respond versus react? And so I tell people, always have 2 or 3 good questions in your back pocket. Like, if you're upset, what question can you ask people? Like, one of my favorite questions to ask people is like, well, what does success look like to you? Because if there's a problem that you're trying to work through or a conflict, I'm trying to get them to think, not just what is the problem today, but what does success look like? So you shift the conversation to something more future-oriented, and you're also getting their perspective, and you have to have that future orientation, that perspective, before you can problem solve.
Anybody else got any questions? Kat, anything you want the regulators to hear, need? No? Good? Ed?
I'm feeling good.
All right. Nan, anything else you want to enlighten us about you haven't said?
Well,
I'm giving you that open-ended.
no, the only thing I would say is one thing that I didn't say that I think is important, and I said it in a different way. But when we're dealing with people, especially when there's frustration, disagreement, a need to do some problem solving, and I said we often need to listen, is I always build into most conversations what I call grown space. And that grown space is, sometimes you just need to let people vent for a hot minute. If you've ever worked in customer service, if you just let them vent for a minute, then they're usually fine. But they just have to say it, and then they realize they've reacted versus responded. And oftentimes it doesn't even take 30 seconds. But it shows them a high level of respect. You probably learned something that is really important, because that is another point about problem solving and conflict management. The issue that people bring to you is oftentimes not the real issue. Okay? That is part of why conflict is a problem solving process, and it is learning to negotiate, because people will often say, this is the problem, this is what I'm upset about. But as you ask them questions, you start to realize that isn't really the biggest issue at hand that you need to deal with. And if you don't ask good questions, you may never address the true underlying issue that's created the problem.
Well, you gonna do that again?
Go back.
Let's see if I can get to that. You're gonna have to piece that together there.
Oh, I can imagine.
We got that.
Okay.
I love it.
Okay, so I think one of the things we were talking about was when you have a disagreement with someone or there's a problem you need to solve, always build in some grown space. Okay? And part of the reason for grown space is it gives them the opportunity to talk about really what is bothering them. And oftentimes people just need to get that off their chest. It's, just like when you're dealing with customer service, if you allow people to groan for a little bit, then they can refocus their energy on, do we want to keep going?